beachheads. Beachheads because they were the first toeholds seized by white men along the edge of North America. No modern amphibious force advancing on any enemy defending coast ever approached more warily than did those settlers towards the silent shore of the red man's continent. At Jamestown, the landing party was greeted by a flight of arrows from out of the silence. The Indians of those parts had met whites before and had been misused by them. But for the most part, the Indians, having no idea of what was coming, were friendly enough, though temperamental. There were only a few 100,000 of them in all of North America, and the idea of sharing their hunting grounds with a few more mouths didn't trouble them. Of the ownership of land and its transfer by purchase, they hadn't the least comprehension. They accepted the trinkets and tools offered in payment for their land as mere gifts of goodwill or as tribute, and they usually came back at intervals for more. It wasn't until the 17th century was well along that they began to realize that their hunting grounds were being taken from them, and too late they got tough. Early in the 1600s, there were shacks used as temporary shelters by European fishermen along the coasts of Maine and Nova Scotia. Quite possibly the Norsemen paused a while, much earlier, on Cape Cod, but there was nothing of permanence, perhaps no intention of permanence, in these camps. The first record of white men coming to North America with the idea of staying is of some French Huguenots in 1564. They built a triangular palisade, which they named Fort Caroline, on an island in the St. Johns River in Florida. Even the island itself has washed away now. St. Augustine as it may have looked about 1585. St. Augustine. A year later, the Spanish, under Pedro Menendez de Aviles, started St. Augustine a few miles south of Fort Caroline. Though St. Augustine was sacked and burned from time to time, it managed to survive as the first permanent European settlement north of Mexico. It was never much more than a military camp, the northernmost of the chain of forts that protected shipping in the Caribbean. The Spanish were well settled in the islands, and St. Augustine was to them a frontier post only a couple of days' sail from civilization. Roanoke. St. Augustine was close to its supply base in Cuba. The first English beachhead, Roanoke Island, was different. In the Sound, just behind the deadly Outer Banks of North Carolina, it lay a long bitter way from England, and Sir Walter Raleigh spent a fortune failing to set up an English nation there. Perhaps he might have succeeded if he and all the folks at home hadn't had to give their full attention to fending off the Spanish Armada just when the Roanoke colony needed supplies and protection. The settlers there built a little earth fort about 50 feet square with bastions at its corners. Time all but obliterated it, but archaeological sleuthing found its outlines, and its small ramparts and surrounding ditch have been put back as they were. A few buttons and buckles and corroded tools have been dug up at the site. As is well known, when relief ships finally reached Roanoke, they found nothing and nobody, only the word Croatan carved into a post. The English heard the Indians say something like Winganda cow and assumed it was the native name of the country. Actually, it meant you wear pretty clothes. The leaders at Roanoke wore the full panoply of armor and bombast-padded breeches of steel morions and flat city caps. The rank and file wore full breeches called slops, tied at the knee, and a pointed doublet with welted shoulders and separate sleeves tied on. Not a few would wear a gold ring in one ear. In place of the starched ruff on the gentry, which must have gone pretty limp on Roanoke Island, the commoners wore wide collars attached to their shirts. There were women along. They wore doublets too, and long skirts, which they called petticoats, and shoes with thick cork soles, called chopines. About their necks was a high collar or a small ruff, and on their heads a close-fitting cap which completely covered their hair. At Jamestown a few years later, where there were only men at first, the clothes of the commonalty were exactly the same as at Roanoke, give or take a little for personal taste. The more pretentious clothes hadn't changed too much either. A hat with a crown and a feather instead of a flat cap, less padding in the breeches, or sometimes ballooning Dutch breeches tied at the knee, with no padding at all. Armor was worn and needed. It wasn't much good against bullets, but it would turn an Indian arrow. Though there are in existence some remarkably good watercolors of Indians and animals made by John White, who was in charge of the Roanoke colony and who was the grandfather of Virginia Dare, the first child of English blood known to have been born in America, they show nothing of life in the colony or of any of the dwellings that were built there. We can be reasonably sure that these were not such logs cabins as have since been set about the place by the hands of modern restorers. Wattle and daub cabin supported on crotchets. Jamestown. Probably the shelters at Roanoke and the first cabins that were built at Jamestown when the tents rotted were much alike, a thatched roof supported on forked posts with walls of wattle and daub. These were made by filling in the wall space with vertical stakes set a few inches apart, then weaving willow or hazel branches in and out horizontally and plastering both sides of the fabric with mud. Such structures didn't have to be invented on the spot. Very poor people all over Europe had been living in them for centuries. These Virginia huts probably had no chimneys, but simply a hole in the roof through which smoke might find its way out, as it did from the wigwams of the Indians. It seems likely that no shiftless allot as the first settlers at Jamestown wouldn't bother with anything that added any work. They wouldn't hunt or fish or plant. They were looking for gold. They didn't bother to dig a well, but took their water from the James River at the ebb tide when the water was least salt. Since no gold turned up, it was deemed necessary to ship something home to the London Company, who were the sponsors of the venture. So John Smith put everybody to splitting clapboards to their vast distaste. These were not to cover their own dwellings. They were strictly for export. Modern clapboards are full-length lumber sawn to the wedge shape, which makes them overlap readily. In the 17th century, clapboards were only about 4 feet long, and they were shaped by being split or riven from a log that long and usually about 10 inches thick. An implement called a froe was used for the job. It was really a wide wedge, a straight heavy blade, at one end of which a handle was hafted, making a right angle with the spine of the blade. A log was stood on end, against a prop, the edge of the froe was held across its upper end, and the thick spine of the blade was pounded with a club until the log was halved. The halves were then split repeatedly until the log was reduced to a pile of, barring accidents, 24 boards, each about 5/8 of an inch thick on one edge and about nothing on the other. A 10-inch diameter log gave you roughly 5-inch clapboards. On a building, these were lapped an inch or so to keep out the weather. Such clapboards were widely used in this country well into the 19th century. Riven clapboards. The inset shows the froe and the splitting needed to produce the first clapboard.